Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where international affairs are discussed. I'm Martin Zubko. Today we're going to speak about a very interesting topic touching China. But instead of geopolitics and internal or domestic politics, we're going to speak about Chinese theories of international affairs. For this reason, I have my expert today, Ferran Pérez Mena. Hello.
Hello.
Dr. Mena is Assistant Professor in International Relations of East Asia in the School of Government and International Affairs, Durham University. His research focuses on three main areas: the transnational connections between Chinese and Western non-state actors and their impact on world politics; the second, the formation of non-Western transnational elite networks and their impact on world politics; and lastly, the relationship between Chinese IR scholars and Chinese state and the formation of Chinese ideas about world politics and international order. Interestingly enough, this year, 2024, Ferran published his book about Chinese international relations scholars and thoughts called Contender States and Modern Chinese International Thought from the Republican Era until the Chinese School of International Relations. And because of this book and Ferran's research and history about his research about Chinese thoughts and international theory, I'm very happy that he accepted the invitation to tell us more about this fascinating topic. Because when we read about China, usually in the West, we read about China from the Western perspectives, or we have some Chinese scholars writing about China also from the Western perspectives, which is very interesting. But what is on the other side? How Chinese scholars think, how they develop international relation thoughts. These are the topics that we will go through with Ferran today. So Ferran, let's start with the first question, and I would like you to provide an overview of the major contemporary schools of thought in Chinese international relations, for instance, Shanghai School or Tsinghua School.
So first of all, I think it's important to clarify the distinction between the so-called Chinese School of IR and the Shanghai School or the Tsinghua School. The Chinese School of IR, or the Chinese School movement, as Professor Lu Peng from Fujian Normal University calls it, can be described as a loose group of Chinese IR scholars based in mainland China who have divergent research interests. These scholars have been advancing IR theory by drawing from traditional Chinese political thought, such as Confucianism, as well as Anglo-American IR theory. I think it's important to keep in mind that this movement began to gain traction in China in the early 2000s due to the efforts of some Chinese IR scholars who were highly critical of the project of international relations with Chinese characteristics, because according to them, this project was too nationalist and ideological. Therefore, it was necessary to develop a more scientific IR theory that could transcend these limitations. In my opinion, I think that the concept of Chinese School of IR works as an umbrella term to include different theoretical projects and other schools, such as the Tsinghua School and even the Shanghai School. This umbrella term generally includes the relational theory developed by Professor Qin, Yan Xuetong's moral realism, and the Tsinghua School. And even though Professor Yan is very critical of the idea of developing a Chinese school, also the Confucian tradition of the Tianxia developed by Zhao Dingyang, and now the Shanghai School of IR and their ideas about peaceful symbiosis.
And why Shanghai and Tsinghua? Is it because they are strong universities, or is there any historical concept behind?
I think my sense is that actually they were the first institutions in China that introduced Anglo-American IR theory into China. And I think they had this long tradition since the late 70s, early 80s, that have been importing this Anglo-American IR theory. And also as a consequence of that, they also have been trying to sort of to develop, let's say, indigenous IR theories. So I think that's the reason why we see how Tsinghua on the one side and also Fudan are very famous institutions that have been working on developing these ideas.
Let's speak a little bit about the historical and intellectual origins of the Shanghai School of Thought in international relations. How are those thoughts accepted within China?
Mm-hmm. So the Shanghai School of IR has historically represented a particular ecosystem within the Chinese IR academia. It's linked to Fudan University, an institution that traditionally has been more liberal and pluralist for Chinese standards. And also the Shanghai School also played a central role in importing Anglo-American IR theory into China. Also, Fudan is an interesting institution because it has close relations with the government, as well as other transnational networks of scholars based in the US and Europe. I would say that the Shanghai School of IR is one of the newest schools in the sense that their theoretical contributions to the so-called Chinese School of IR began to emerge in the 2010s, something like that. And this was a key historical moment characterized by the geopolitical effects of the financial crisis of 2007, the way how China managed that crisis, and the existence of broader debates about China's role within globalization. No? Also, I think that during this period, it became clear that there was an ongoing transformation in Sino-American relations and the structure of the neoliberal globalization, which had been key to enabling China's geopolitical rise after the 80s, right? I think the theoretical work of the Shanghai School of IR has been accepted within Chinese academia and beyond, and their ideas frequently appear in discussions about the Chinese School of IR and the theoretical contributions of Chinese scholars to the field of international relations.
So let's go to the core principles and theoretical foundations so we can better understand the Shanghai School in international relations.
So one of the main ideas of the Shanghai School has been the notion of symbiosis. Originally, this concept was put forward by the sociology professor Hu Shoujun from Fudan University in 2006. And basically, to provide some historical context, the book where this idea appeared was published during a golden moment of Sino-American relations and the neoliberal globalization, when even the conservative intellectual Neil Ferguson perceived Sino-American relations to be in a state of symbiosis that he called chimerica. But anyway, the book focused on social life, right? Where Professor Hu aimed to theorize the idea of symbiosis, a concept that derives from evolutionary biology that seeks to understand the long-term interactions and of different organisms within the same ecosystem, right? And one of Professor Hu's main conclusions was that when these ideas are applied to the realm of social life, then the societal consequences are that human beings need to cooperate with others to survive and to develop, leading to the possibility of symbiosis, right? And typically, these symbiotic relations characterized by a struggle and compromise can lead to the improvement of the overall relationship between humans, right? And this type of argument strongly resonates with China's understanding of the neoliberal globalization and its relations with the US before the financial crisis, right? So essentially, one of the theoretical foundations of the Shanghai School is a form of pluralist universalism, which can also be found in the work of Amitav Acharya and his project of global IR. For example, the Shanghai School of IR emphasizes the idea of commonality and amid difference, and their ideas are underpinned by the acknowledgement that we live in a plural world with different civilizations, cultures, and ideas. And while they emphasize their singularity, they also embrace the post-colonial thought of scholars like Lili Ling and acknowledge and value the hybridity that emerges from the interaction between different worlds, right? Importantly, they also argue that differences between actors do not necessarily lead to conflict. I think this is very important. They actually contend that different actors or civilizations, for example, can peacefully coexist and interact on the basis of equality, right? So in this regard, they emphasize that cooperative relations between different actors and how these relations can be maximized to improve the economy, for example.
Mm-hmm. Ferran, may I ask you, when you say actors, does this school understand actors in the same way like in the West? So we have, for instance, state, we have the non-governmental organization, we have international institutions, we have different actors, so who is actor, basically? Because this is, I think, quite important. When we speak about symbiotic relationship, between or among who?
Actually, it's a very important point. Yeah, they refer actually like symbiotic relations can entail interactions between, for example, different states like China, the US, for example. That can also involve the interaction between Chinese institutions and Western institutions. That can also involve the interaction between Chinese, let's say, non-state actors, even though that's a problematic concept, and maybe Western state actors. So actually, what they envision is a kind of like a wall or social wall with different levels of, actors that they interact at multiple levels, right?
Mm-hmm. I see.
So it doesn't have to be understood per se as a state-centric approach, even though the state plays a very important role in the way how they understand or envision this type of symbiotic system, right? And symbiotic relations.
And what about key figures and the contribution to the international relations theory? How is this understood when you speak about Shanghai School?
Mm-hmm. So several scholars have contributed to the emergence of the Shanghai School of IR, including Professor Ren Xiao, Professor Yan Xuetong, Professor Zhu Changhe. These scholars were among the first to use the idea of symbiosis in the field of international relations theory in the 2010s or so. And for example, one of the Professor Ren Xiao's early contributions to the idea of symbiosis can be found in a journal article he published in 2013. So in this popular article, Professor Ren Xiao sought to understand the traditional international order of East Asia that some people have referred to as a tributary system. But basically, he aimed to understand how an international order characterized by the coexistence of small and large countries work together to establish peaceful regional order, according to him, right? And he argued that despite the asymmetries of power, which might suggest a lack of equality between among these states or countries, the traditional order in East Asia was a harmonious one, right? And he called this type of order a symbiotic system. Then Professor Ren Xiao continued developing this concept and began to applying it to contemporary world politics, right? So in a series of publications that began to appear after 2015 or so, he attempted to understand how the construction of a symbiotic order or symbiotic peace could be developed in the current geopolitical situation, right? The main goal of this order was to create a global governance system based on the idea of unity through diversity that could prevent supposedly the imposition of uniformity among its members and foster collective development, right? In a paper published in 2012, if I'm not mistaken, Professor Yan Xuetong discussed how the creation of a symbiotic development of international society has the power to make globalization and the development of a multipolar world more efficient. So basically, as you can see, ideas about symbiosis reflect the notion that this type of symbiotic relations can contribute to the multipolarization of the system and maximize the economic benefits of belonging to that type of collective world order.
Let's turn the page now and let's speak about Tsinghua School, which is quite different.
Yeah, so basically, while the Tsinghua School tends to be included within the umbrella of the Chinese School of IR because they have clearly contributed to the emergence of an indigenous IR theory in China that draws from traditional political thought. I think it's important to recognize that their project, and particularly the theoretical work of Professor Yan Xuetong, seeks to achieve something different. For example, Professor Yan Xuetong, he rejects the legitimacy of the Chinese School of IR, and he contends that no single theory can represent the complex history of China and the different strands of political thought that have existed within Chinese history, right? And additionally, unlike scholars such as Qin Yaqing, Professor Yan Xuetong does not believe that Chinese IR scholars should develop a theory that it is specifically Chinese. Actually, he argues that Chinese IR scholars need to build something that is popular and used by scholars outside of China. I think this perspective is rooted in Yan Xuetong's defense of a more positive scientific method. And he basically believes that if IR theory is understood as a scientific inquiry, then IR theory should be universally valid.
So can we say that Yan Xuetong influenced the Tsinghua school in a major way?
Yes. He was one of the key scholars that actually developed the Tsinghua school. Actually, he used to be the president or the chancellor of the Tsinghua, of the Department of International Relations at Tsinghua.
So we have like two major schools at the moment. And what about others? Like, are there any different thoughts that are maybe not that famous, but still exist in China?
Well, we can talk about, for example, beyond the Tsinghua approach. I think of, for example, like Qin Yaqing's relational theory is also an important strain. Some scholars also tend to include the work on the Tianxia by the philosopher Zhao Dingyang, as he provides an alternative to the Westphalian ideas about world order. And even though not many scholars discuss them, I also believe that ongoing conversations within the field of global studies in China could be considered another stream. So scholars such as Wang Yizhou, Qin Yaqing, and Chen Ziming have been discussing what it means for China to be a global power and how China's national interest can be protected in a globalized world.
China is very fussy or very careful about the traditional Chinese philosophy. This is like main canon of knowledge, anyway. So I'm interested, if someone is developing international relations theories, either Tsinghua or Shanghai, how those people integrate with the traditional philosophy? Because I think that's quite an interesting question to ask.
So I think there are two ways in which this is done. So on the one hand, scholars recover traditional political thought from the spring and autumn and warring states periods to understand basically how unipolar systems transition into a multipolar system. So for example, for those who don't know much about history or Chinese history, the Zhou dynasty, which could be described as a hegemon, was operating within a sort of unipolar system. And then they basically saw the emergence of a multipolar system after its collapse, right? So some Chinese IR scholars, such as Yan Xuetong from Tsinghua, believe that lessons from that period can help us understand the historical era following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, and the ongoing process of multipolarization that the international system is experiencing. In contrast, others like Qin Yaqing draw on Confucian and the Taoist traditions because they believe that these traditions represent the cultural background in which Chinese culture is embedded. So, in other words, it is assumed that the mobilization of Confucianism represents a form of a specific cultural authenticity that can be used to develop knowledge that can either counter the penetration of Western IR theories in China or complement them.
So there is still a close connection between the philosophy and international relations theory.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So we know something about the theories, and now each theory has some main concepts, and it's similar like in the Western world. So let's speak about some key concepts in Chinese international relations theory. And I think let's start with the Tsinghua school and the moral realism.
in a nutshell, the concept of moral realism is used to explain the rise of emerging powers and the subsequent transformation of the international order. So Professor Yan Xuetong contends that the political leadership serves as a core independent variable that can explain why some rising states can displace a dominant state. So in other words, moral realism is rooted in the idea that the shifts in international power lies in the thoughts of the leaders rather than in material force. So in this context, drawing from Chunzi, which he used to be like an ancient philosopher, Professor Yan Xuetong argues that if a rising state practices morality, it can improve its strategic credibility. And basically, the construction of this political legitimacy then can be used to potentially displace a dominant hegemon and contribute to changes in power configurations, international orders, and norms. To be honest, in my opinion, Yan Xuetong, Professor Yan Xuetong, is trying to offer a technocratic approach for a rising China that is competing in a geopolitical context characterized by clear asymmetries of power between the US and China.
And can we find another example of this moral realism outside of China? Like, for instance, you have some situation or state or some actor, and you can apply this theory outside of China. Is this even possible, or is this moral realism specifically designed for China?
I think he's, to be honest, this is quite implicit, because I think that, to be honest, he's providing this theory to policymakers in China, right? But then if you try to apply this theory to other great powers, because actually he is concerned about other great powers, I think it's a bit difficult, right? Because not because it cannot be done, but actually the question is, what great power is behaving in a moral and ethical way, right? And there's also the question about whether China is behaving in such a way, right? So I think that the tricky aspect of applying this theory beyond China, or even within the context of China, is actually to assess like the morality and ethics, right? And what it means for a great power, to behave in such a way, right? Because it seems to me that nowadays great powers don't tend to behave in this way. So I think that's a challenge of using that theory in any context, to be honest.
I'm asking because morality as a word might have different definitions and meanings, and especially in these times, you can see the world conflicts, and how the states behave, how the actors behave. I think each state has different understanding of moral. So how is this in China? Maybe based on your research, if this was defined like very specifically, or was it defined like more generally?
Okay, so the thing is that actually, like, he draws from this idea of human authority, which, if I'm not mistaken, it used to be Confucian concept, right? Basically, in my opinion, like, the idea of human authority resonates with Gramscian ideas of hegemony, in the sense that basically you are kind of ruling by consent, right? You are ruling in a way that actually, even though there's a clear leadership, people follow you because of this collective consent, right? Of course, we know that consents are normally constructed through force and violence, but basically it's this kind of idealized understanding of hegemony where actually like a ruler or a government is actually ruling through consent in a way that the people accept that leadership, but also see that leadership from a positive perspective, right? And that also, it's like a magnet, because if you supposedly rule from a position of consent, where like people are happy with the way how you rule, then that means that other people, other states will want to align with you, or to sort of like, or to follow your model.
I see. Okay. Let's talk about the second concept, and that's Chinese exceptionalism. And how is this interpreted across various Chinese schools or maybe theories or maybe some philosophical streams?
So for example, Qing's relational theory and the work of the Shanghai School of IR revolve around the idea that China's peaceful rise is possible, or that cooperation among small and large states can be achieved through harmonious relations. Some of these ideas draw from the idealization of China's imperial past and the regional order that imperial China was able to develop until the arrival of Western imperial powers. It is often said that imperial China created a rather stable and harmonious order where interstate conflict was almost non-existent. And this is also presented as a contrast with the conflictual and tragic European history where constant warfare between different empires and polities prevail, right? However, in my opinion, these views are somewhat problematic. I think that these idealized views of a Pacific China mask the violence that existed in imperial China. Professor Sankaran Krishna from University of Hawaii at Manoa has a great article where he debunks some of these myths. And also the Western expansion of different Chinese empires entailed the use of violence and force against different populations, right? So different Chinese empires also struggle with nomadic groups, right? So in my opinion, historically speaking, it does not make sense to idealize imperial history to argue that contemporary China can rise peacefully. I think this form of high historicism does not help us understand how the combination of different international structures, economic systems, ideologies, and social forces can lead to different political outcomes. I think, to be honest, this exceptionalism benefited from the experience of China and US relations from the 1970s to the financial crisis of 2007, right? Which was a very particular period in world history where several factors align. But actually, we can see how all these factors that contributed to that apparent rise are vanishing.
When we say peaceful, some people might say, oh, it's peaceful because there is no war. But some people might say, it's not peaceful because we have the planes flying around our island and military ships clashing with the other countries and using water cannons, you know. So this is, I think, also a very interesting perspective that you mentioned, that peaceful concept of the Chinese exceptionalism, which I think it's very worth of researching. That's my opinion, that we have to be careful about using peaceful as a word, because peaceful might mean some different connotations in different instances and events. So that's very interesting. So let's jump to another question, and that's, how do Chinese schools of thought engage with a critique of Western schools or Western international relations theories? And are there any overlaps that we can maybe highlight, that Chinese theories and the Western theories and the critique?
So I think this is a very interesting question, because on the one hand, the Chinese School of International Relations emerged in part as a project to address the shortcomings of Western IR theories when analyzing the supposedly peaceful rise of China. So basically, the critique of Western IR theories stemmed from a collective desire to convince Western IR scholars and also policymakers that China's peaceful rise was indeed possible, right? On the other hand, intriguingly, the engagement with the critique of Western international relations is a result of a political willingness to actually integrate China's national interests within these novel IR theories, right? So although Chinese IR scholars appear to embrace certain forms of postcolonial thinking to critique the West, they ultimately use these strategies to justify or China's interest within the sphere of the knowledge production, right? So what I find particularly interesting is that the critique of Eurocentrism, which gained traction in the 90s, coincided with the Communist Party's revival of Confucianism and promotion of a new form of cultural nationalism, right? However, the issue with Eurocentrism actually was not merely that Western higher theories ignore non-Western experiences and promoted like specific forms of knowledge, but actually the problem was that Eurocentrism failed to allow Chinese higher scholars to advocate for Chinese national interests. So I think that is quite interesting.
Mm-hmm. And what about those overlaps? Do we have any significant overlaps?
Okay, I will give you an example. Let's take constructivism, right? So we know that for constructivism, identities are important, right? And the norms are important, and but also the states are important, right? So I think for the Chinese scholars who work in the field of constructivism, they accept that, right? So they accept these premises, right? So identity is important, norms are important, and the states are important. In which ways there's the Chinese don't agree with Western higher scholars, right? In the interaction between the actors, right? So, and also in the process of creating an identity. I will give you an example. Constructivism in the West, perhaps because of the traditional or the legacy of Hegelian dialectics, or we think that when two actors are different, they can share an identity through a process of, like, I don't know, communication, or through, like, I don't know, institutions, etc., right? But they keep their identities. So they are kind of individuals with specific identities that at some points they can share that identity, right? But the premise is that there's a kind of conflictual relation between these two actors because they have different identities, even though at some point they can share some norms and also some other identities, right? For the Chinese, they don't believe in this because they depart from Chinese dialectics. And actually, according to this system, when you have two people or two actors, for example, it's like the yin-yang. I'm pretty sure you might have seen the yin-yang painting, where basically there's basically two sections, the white section and the black section. But within those sections, there's black within the white and white within the black, right? So that means that actually when two actors like are in this process of relating to each other, they are kind of transferring their identities, right? In a way that, for example, if I'm talking to you at this very moment, I'm kind of embracing something from you, and you're embracing something from me, and I'm keeping something from you, and you're keeping something from me, your identity, right? And that creates a dynamic of more peaceful change because actually there's no clash, because there's this kind of dynamic relation within the production of identities and interpersonal relations, right? And I think that's where Western constructivism and Chinese constructivism differ, right? In the way how identity is produced and in the relation between the actors and how that is, and the relation between the actors, if that makes sense.
So let's speak a little bit about this concept, the economic statecraft and its role in international relations from the Chinese point of view. Maybe you can say which school is more, focusing on this economic statecraft so we can understand it.
Mm-hmm. So in my opinion, I think the Shanghai School aims to safeguard the autonomy of the Chinese model and China's capacity for economic development in a globalized world, right? Even though this dynamic, we know that is gradually evolving. But while the issue of economic statecraft might not be explicit, emphasizing this approach, it remains, I think, a central element of this school, right? Because according to this tradition, the state's ability to foster interdependent relations and also these symbiotic relations is crucial for economic development, right? So basically, the underlying premise is that these symbiotic relations between actors, again, what we discussed earlier, institutions within the international system, can lead to the maximization of economic gains, ultimately contributing to China's independent economic growth. So I think that, in my opinion, this perspective could be seen as a form of nationalist globalization theory.
Do you think that this theory has sort of a historical background, or it's more based on the contemporary Chinese expansion, the economic growth, the technology, we have urbanization in China and many of those modern trends?
I mean, economic statecraft has always existed in China, right? In Imperial China, I think Isabella Weber published a book about how China basically dodged like this, what's the word, like the doctrine shock in the 80s. And the first chapter of that book is incredible because she talks about ancient Chinese statecraft. So we know that actually China has a long tradition of economic statecraft. I think what we need to keep in mind is that these ideas of symbiosis and statecraft, they are relatively new, right? And I think we need to frame or situate them within the context of globalization, because actually they really resonate with the way how China was embedding within globalization, the type of economic relations China wanted to promote. And also actually after the arrival of Donald Trump, actually when people began to talk about deglobalization, decoupling, the end of globalization, in China, they were actually still defending globalization, right? And I think this economic statecraft that is embedded within ideas about symbiosis, it was a key aspect of all of this, right? The idea that China has to keep these symbiotic relations and has to protect the openness of this global system, because actually it was that openness and those symbiotic relations that actually enabled the economic growth and geopolitical rise of China, right? So I think we need to situate these ideas within this specific geopolitical and historical context.
I have one very hard question for you, Ferran, but I must ask because you are a very good expert. What about Tsinghua's school perspective on soft power?
I think the issue of soft power within the Tsinghua school is implicit issue, but it's basically a little bit related to what I said earlier about moral realism, right? So for Tsinghua school, in my opinion, soft power derives from the ability of the leaders to behave according to what Professor Yan called human authority, right? Because this form of governance entails the necessity of a strong leadership that behaves according to a high moral and ethical position. Again, we can discuss what that means and whether it's possible to achieve that, right? But anyway, so according to him, this is the best form of governance because you are ruling in a way that will compel other states to ally with you or to follow your model, right? So, of course, this is highly connected to the issue of soft power because according to this theory, if you are ruling according to certain moral rules and responsibility, then more states will feel compelled to ally with you or to work with you, right? So in some ways, I think these are some of the imaginaries that China is spreading in the global south, right? So the idea that China is behaving in a moral and ethical way, specifically in the context of the war in Ukraine and its involvement in the Middle East and Palestine, right? So it's a way to say that China is not like the US or like the European Union.
What is the most interesting Chinese soft power instrument for you as a researcher?
This is a very difficult question because I always discuss this with my colleagues, and actually my impression is that at the moment Chinese soft power is not really working. It doesn't have the same power that American soft power has, right? Maybe it's because of the Chinese language. Maybe it's because of the legacies of communism and how people in the West or in the South, global South, sort of imagine that. So I think that actually the soft power tools that China is using have to do with maybe the way how the Chinese government is socializing certain elites in the global south or in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative. So, for example, the importance of people-to-people relations in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative, perhaps this close relationship with the states who are involved in the Belt and Road Initiative, or simply with the fact that China, they doesn't seem to really care about the political systems of the countries that they're working on. And that really is a form of soft power, because supposedly they are not kind of imposing certain ideas, supposedly. So I think the main tool of soft power is actually the socialization of national elites into certain specific forms about how to develop economically and maybe govern your state, right? But I think definitely in general terms, I'm not sure whether Chinese soft power is actually working, and definitely Chinese soft power is not what US soft power is, or even the European Union soft power is, to be honest.
Okay, let's go to a very serious one, and that's the security. How the Chinese schools of international relations understand the concept of security?
So I think that, again, both the Qing's relational theory of IR and the Shanghai School of IR have an interesting understanding of security. And this has to do with the way they understand the social world. So as I mentioned before, they defend a form of moralist universalism and non-Hegelian dialectics, basically this fancy word, that basically this allows them to argue that two antagonistic actors or parts do not clash, but can contribute to a collective transformation where both actors are being peacefully transformed at the same time. So basically what I just explained earlier. And they oppose the logics of Hegelian dialectics and instead promote Taoist dialectics that are non-confrontational. So this has massive implications for the way they understand security, right? Because in this slide, security is seen as a collective enterprise. So for this reason, security dilemmas are to be resolved supposedly through multilateral institutions and the international cooperation among different actors or states, institutions, etc., right? So it's not a coincidence that actually Qin Yaqing and Ren Xiao have advocated for the reform of the international organizations that underpin the liberal international order so that security problems can be resolved collectively and can accommodate China's interests within that framework. I think in some ways, to be honest, their positions could be understood as a kind of liberal internationalism with Chinese characteristics. Of course, some scholars question whether all of this is just a form of propaganda that has infiltrated within the production of higher knowledge to buy time and to ensure that China can continue with its economic development. But I think they do have interesting understandings of security as a result of the philosophical foundations of their theories.
This security question, when we speak about Taiwan, South China Sea, and the Philippines, and Russia and Ukraine, and all those, things around, how is the publishing of security ideas in China? Do scholars apply those international relations theories, I mean Chinese ones, to the modern conflicts? Or they mostly develop the theory as a theoretical stream?
Yeah, some of them they do actually, but this is kind of an ongoing project, in my opinion. I think like Qin Yaqing and Ren Xiao. So I think these streams of Chinese international theory, they are kind of providing this theoretical framework, right? They are kind of providing this big picture. But for example, we are still seeing how other scholars are kind of trying to implement them or use them to understand, the conflict with Taiwan, or the security situation in the South China Sea, or through the Belt and Road Initiative. I have seen actually how some scholars are using actually these ideas of symbiosis in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative, for example. But this is just new publications that have been coming out in the past maybe 5 years or something like that. Yeah.
When I speak with Chinese people, usually in UK, because this is where I am very often, they often tell me that China should be understood as civilization. And then we jump to the topic of civilizational identity. So can you please explain us what does it mean and how the schools are working with this concept?
Okay, so maybe I can talk about the idea of civilizational identity, and maybe I can talk about
Please.
the way how this is related to the schools. So actually in China, there's a belief that China is not a state, it's not a nation state, right? They think that they are civilization, that actually, even though they experience like Western imperialism and the collapse of the Qing Empire, in the process of the emergence of a new state, national state after 1912, that civilization identity and that civilizational state continued through the Republic of China, and then it was kind of embraced by the Communist Party, and it was a huge part of the establishment of the PRC in 1949, right? So this idea that actually there are some cool, like there's a cultural background, there's a long history that sort of contribute to this very particular and exceptional identity, which is the Chinese identity, that can be understood in civilizational terms, right? Because again, it's not a nation state, but China is a civilization, right? And that's basically the explanation about what civilization identity is, right? But actually, when we apply this to understand the Chinese school of thought, I think this civilizational identity is rather implicit. For example, in the work of Qin Yaqing, no? He talks about the concept of a cultural community and how this cultural community is a community of practice where a shared background knowledge, meaning the culture, plays a significant role in the knowledge production and the theoretical innovation, right? But, you know, some scholars like Dr. Choi basically suggest that actually Qin is not very explicit about the boundaries of the Chinese cultural community. It's not always clear whether they talk about, or they also incorporate the diaspora, you know, Chinese people that are born in the West, or, you know, there's always, it's a very, let's say, fuzzy concept. But perhaps this civilizational identity is evident in the work of philosopher Xiaoding Yang and the Tianxia theory. Actually, my friend Dr. Chayu Liang has written a great PhD thesis about this, about how these ideas about civilization have been reproducing since basically the empire, and then they were taken and they were continued through the modern Chinese state. So I hope he buys a book soon. But basically, Xiaoding Yang, he builds his theory of world order using exceptionalist ideas about Chinese history and Chinese culture to provide an alternative world order to that of the Westphalian system.
Because this is, I think, very important that we should understand China not as a monolith, as a one country with one border, but China means many countries called provinces, you know, in one sort of organizational unit. So that's quite important. That was very great to go through those concepts, Ferran. But now let's do some sort of summary or some sort of generalization. And I would like to know how the theories, the concept that you already explained, how they work in developing Chinese foreign policy.
I think, to be honest, it's a bit difficult to fully know how the production of knowledge circulates within the Chinese state, even though we know that most of the scholars that have operated within the Chinese School of IR have been or are embedded within the Chinese state, and most importantly, with other transnational networks of scholars and global institutions. But for example, we know that Yan Xuetong, for example, he was a member of the consultation committee of the Ministry of Commerce in 2011. And Xing Yeqing, he was the chancellor of China's diplomatic academy, right? So we can see how they were, or they have been very embedded within the Chinese state, right? I think that you can see some connections between the formulation of Chinese IR theory, foreign policy, and perhaps propaganda more importantly. So for example, in 2015, the Journal of International Studies, which is a Chinese journal, published a special issue on the future of globalism and global studies. And key scholars such as Xing Yeqing, Wang Yizhou, and Chen Qimin contributed to it, right? And for example, in that special issue, the idea of a community with a shared future for mankind was mentioned multiple times. But then 2 years later, in Davos and the inaugural Belt and Road Forum for International Cooperation, this concept was promoted by Xi Jinping. So it's not really a coincidence that this concept appeared after the arrival of Donald Trump to the White House, in a context in which some US policymakers were talking about the end of globalization. A similar thing also happened with the idea of symbiosis. So for example, the idea of symbiosis began to be quite popular within the Shanghai circles after the 2010s or so, and began to appear also in the official media. So for example, the China Daily published several articles between 2000 and 2024, where the idea of symbiosis actually was mentioned in relation to China's and US relations, the Belt and Road Initiative, China's relations with the Global South, China's relations with multinational companies, and even Hong Kong, right? So I think we have to pay attention to how they use it, because if we do that, we can see how the mobilization of the concept in media has been quite consistent with the way it has been conceived by these Chinese IR scholars. However, I think it's difficult to know whether the concept of symbiosis, for example, is actually a working concept or beyond the sphere of propaganda. I think this is quite difficult to know.
Right, but at least we have some little help how to go through the topics and understand, because I always say, when you read an article about China, read it twice and then once again, because it's very important to understand China from different perspectives, because it's not a monolith. This is the thing, it's 1 billion people in many provinces. So that's a huge topic as well. Ferran, let's speak a little bit about the book, because when I was researching books for my thesis, and I'm dealing with the Chinese-Russian energy relations, I didn't find many books or comprehensive books about Chinese international relations thoughts. I basically found like 5 in the world, and now this one is 6 that I have, like your one. So can you please describe the book for our audience? Why this book? What's your mission, or what's your main message by publishing the book? And what was your inspiration to write it?
Mm-hmm. Okay, actually the book was my PhD project. And one of the main reasons why I wrote that book, it's because it was a book that I wrote for myself. For the reasons that you mentioned, I couldn't find many books about this topic, like books that provide like an overall account of the transformation and origins of modern Chinese international thought. So that was one of the reasons to write a book for myself. I also thought that I could write a book in the form of an encyclopedia, even though I could have included more authors, to help students to actually understand like the evolution of these ideas and how these ideas have been transformed since the early 20th century, right? And what was my motivation? My motivation was that actually I come from the field of international studies, and actually for some time I have been very interested in these debates about global IR and non-Western IR theory. And even though there has been a huge progress in those fields, and I think, to be honest, all the authors that are working within those fields have the best intentions to advance the field, especially because they want to tackle issues around Eurocentrism, the legacies of colonialism within like the discipline of IR, the silencing of actually non-Western IR scholars, right? I think I was quite discontent with the fact that there was always a tendency to emphasize culture as the main driving factor that contributes to the emergence of non-Western IR scholars, right? IR theory, sorry. So for example, in the context of China, it's always Confucianism, right? This idea of there's this kind of like long history, this long philosophical tradition that is Confucianism that almost explains everything in China, right? And if it's not that, then they only focus on the internal, let's say, ruptures within the Chinese state, either ideological transformations or just political transformations, right? So I wasn't very happy with that type of account. And I thought that it was important to actually to be a little bit more, perhaps, I don't know, cynical and maybe materialist, and offer an account where I argue that actually the production of Chinese international thought from the 1912 until now, it has been influenced by actually China's structural position within the global order since 2012 until now. And by this, what I mean is that actually the Chinese state has been trying to do two things. One is to try to defend itself from other great states. It was Imperial Japan in the early 20th century, even the Soviet Union, the United States. So there's always has been this kind of, I wouldn't say obsession, but this idea of, okay, we need to protect our autonomy within global politics. But most importantly, they have operated within a context where they had to catch up with other great powers, right? Again, like it was Imperial Japan, it was the West, now the US. And that structural position shapes the production of knowledge in a very particular way. And also with the fact that China was always connected to other great powers, that kind of helped us to understand not only why the production of knowledge has been produced in a certain way, but how knowledge has been produced, right? So basically, I'm just trying to offer a non-culturalist understanding of the production of international thought in China. And I'm also trying to exceptionalize the production of international thought in China, because instead of talking about the non-West, we should talk about contender states, right? Which is a very particular state that, again, has confronted other great powers and has always been trying to catch up with the West, particularly. And they are states that normally tend to be led by a state class, that its reproduction depends on sort of hegemonizing the state. And actually, when we situate the production of international thought within this idea of the contender states, what we see is that actually China shares a lot of commonalities with states like Russia, the Soviet Union, Turkey, and also Germany, like Germany in the early 20th century, Napoleonic France. And that really kind of like help us to question these ideas about the non-West and the West, right? Because what we see is this kind of more dynamic evolution of geopolitics where, you know, we have these states that share some similarities and they produce certain forms of knowledge.
I think many students and researchers will ask, how did you access the sources?
Actually, SOAS library is an amazing place. You can find lots of sources in Mandarin, but also I also use the library of Edinburgh University, to be honest, and the library of Durham, because they also have access to databases from China. And to be honest, most of the papers are there. You can just publish, you can download them easily if you have access to those databases and you can read Mandarin. So yeah, it wasn't very difficult to write this book. Actually, perhaps I really struggled with the sources for the first chapter on the Republic of China. But for the rest, it was kind of easy to find some resources.
Yeah, because I noticed that in your book, you put English description and then in the brackets the Chinese name. So that's extremely helpful, because you go to that original or concept or originality, the authentic sources, which is very helpful for all the students and researchers as well. Ferran, the last question for today's interview. I'm interested in your thoughts about the future of the Chinese international relations thoughts, and maybe your opinion, how is this development going at the moment, and what can we expect in the future?
It's actually very difficult because, like in the conclusion of my book, I don't know if I'm wrong, I don't know. I cannot sort of predict the future, but what I say is that because China is still struggling with this structural position, so even though we know, or people talk about a global China, we know that China has a lot of military power, economic power. I think that it's still trying to catch up with the West. I mean, otherwise, it wouldn't make sense, or otherwise the US wouldn't be doing what it's doing, right? So, this fierce competition actually is about ensuring that China cannot develop, right? That's it's not a moral or ethic statement, that's a fact, right? So that means that China is still in this position where it's catching up, right? In my opinion, as long as China remains in that position of catching up, we will still see the emergence of theories that look very nationalist. Even theories that look like globalization theory, or even theories that try to understand the behavior of a global China, I don't think that they will be able to fully remove themselves from those structural limitations that also determine the way how knowledge is produced, right? Then the question is that, okay, so for example, if there's if the US and China and other big powers manage to reach some sort of agreement where they have equal relations, maybe in that context, we might be able to see other forms of knowledge that might be influenced by that type of arrangement, right? So perhaps we will see nationalism, but perhaps not as the way how we are seeing it now, right? But also it could be that there's a war between the US and China wins the war, even though it's very unlikely. And we could see more ideas that have to do with hegemony, right? So it could be that in that context, then we will see how the Chinese scholars, they don't care much about the state, and they focus on the production of theories that attempt to build global consent, right? Like the way how the Americans did after the Second World War, right? But I think it's always very difficult to foresee what's going to happen, because we don't know what's going to happen in the future in relation to China's relation with the US, in the global South. We don't really know, right? But that's kind of one of the ideas that I kind of develop in the conclusion, right? But I don't know, maybe I may be wrong.
Ferran, thank you very much for your insightful thoughts about sharing your knowledge and expertise based on your research and career. I'm very thankful for your time and for your attitude that you could share all those with us. Thank you for being on IO Thinker.
No, thank you so much for the invitation. It was a pleasure to be here. And yeah, I was very happy to be here. Thank you so much.
See you next time.
See you next time.